Hey guys, tonight we're talking about a plant that is simultaneously legal in most of the United States, banned in 6 states, classified as a dangerous opioid by the FDA, celebrated as a miracle cure by millions of Americans, and quietly consumed every single day by veterans, nurses, teachers, and suburban parents who will never once think of themselves as drug users. It grows on a tree. An ordinary, unremarkable tree. The kind you'd walk past without a second glance somewhere in the jungles of Southeast Asia. And for centuries, the people living near that tree chewed its leaves the way Americans drink coffee, to wake up, to work harder, to push through exhaustion in sweltering heat. Nobody wrote alarming news articles about it. No agency launched a task force. No senator gave a speech. It was just a leaf, a completely boring, completely natural leaf that happened to contain one of the most pharmacologically bizarre combinations of chemicals ever found in a plant. Then the West found it, and everything went sideways. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. Here is the thing about Kratom that breaks people's brains the first time they hear it. Take 2 grams, roughly the amount that fits in a teaspoon, and it behaves like a strong stimulant. Your focus sharpens, your energy climbs, your mood lifts in that clean, functional way that makes you feel capable rather than wired. It's not unlike a double espresso, except it lasts longer and doesn't make your hands shake. Farmers in Thailand and Malaysia used it exactly this way for generations, a natural productivity tool grown in their own backyard. Now take 8 grams of the same plant, the same dried leaf, the same powder bought from the same source. Suddenly it's not coffee anymore. The stimulant effects evaporate, replaced by something else entirely. Sedation, pain relief, a warm heaviness that anyone who has ever taken a prescription opioid would recognize immediately. The same substance, the same tree, a completely different drug determined purely by how much of it you swallow. This dose-dependent identity crisis is not a marketing claim or an exaggeration. It is the literal, documented pharmacological reality of Kratom, and it is the reason that scientists, regulators, and users have been arguing in circles for over a decade without reaching a single agreed-upon conclusion. The plant refuses to be categorized, and in a world built entirely on categories, that makes it uniquely dangerous, not necessarily to the people who use it, but to every institution that needs to decide what to do with it. The tree itself is called Mitragina speciosa, and it belongs to the coffee family. That detail alone is quietly hilarious. Kratom is essentially a deranged cousin of the plant that keeps the entire global workforce functional every morning. It grows natively in Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Papua New Guinea, thriving in the humid, tropical environments where the soil is rich and the heat is relentless. The leaves are large, dark green, and unremarkable. The tree can grow up to 30 feet tall. Nothing about its appearance suggests that it contains a molecule potent enough to eventually land it in the crosshairs of the United States Drug Enforcement Administration. That molecule, or rather the primary one, is called mitragynine. It makes up roughly 66% of the alkaloid content in kratom leaves, and is responsible for most of the plant's effects. Mitragynine acts on the brain's opioid receptors, but not in the same way that morphine or heroin does. The distinction matters enormously, and we'll get into it properly later, but the short version is this. Mitragynine is what scientists call a partial agonist, meaning it activates opioid receptors without pushing them to full capacity. Theoretically, this means it produces opioid-like effects with less of the respiratory depression, the breathing slowdown, that kills people in overdose situations, theoretically. The second major alkaloid is 7-hydroxymetragenine, and this one is where the story starts getting darker. It exists in much smaller quantities in raw kratom leaves, roughly 2% of the total alkaloid content, but it is dramatically more potent than metragenine. When kratom is processed, concentrated, or extracted, 7-hydroxymetragenine can become the dominant active compound. And unlike metragenine, it behaves in ways that look much more like classical opioids. The FDA has fixated on this alkaloid. Critics of kratom point to it constantly. It is the chemical reason that a leaf chewed by Thai farmers for centuries can become something genuinely alarming once industrial processing gets involved. But here's what almost nobody discusses when that fact gets raised. The Thai farmers were not doing industrial processing. They were chewing leaves. The 7-hydroxymetragenine content in a chewed kratom leaf is negligible compared to what ends up in a concentrated kratom extract shot sold at an American gas station in 2024. The plant didn't change. The humans around it did. The history of kratom in Southeast Asia stretches back at least several hundred years, and possibly much longer. The earliest written records come from the early 19th century, when a Dutch botanist named Peter Willem Korthals documented the plant during his time studying flora in the region. Local communities had obviously been using it long before anyone thought to write it down. In rural Thailand and Malaysia, kratom leaves were chewed fresh or dried and brewed into tea. Workers in physically demanding jobs, rubber tappers, rice farmers, manual labourers, used it to manage fatigue and pain. In some communities, it was also used to treat diarrhea, fever, and as a way to manage opium withdrawal, which is perhaps the earliest recorded hint of its complicated relationship with addiction medicine. Thailand banned kratom in 1943, not because of health concerns, but because it was cutting into the government's opium tax revenue. People were using kratom instead of government-taxed opium, and the authorities responded the way authorities tend to respond when something threatens tax revenue. They criminalized the cheaper alternative. For decades, possession of kratom in Thailand carried serious criminal penalties. The plant was illegal in the country, where it had grown wild for centuries, harvested by the same people whose grandparents had used it without incident. The absurdity of that fact would eventually contribute to Thailand reversing course decades later, but that part of the story comes much later. In the United States, kratom arrived quietly. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, it was barely a footnote, an obscure ethnobotanical curiosity sold in small quantities on internet forums dedicated to psychoactive plants. The people buying it were mostly researchers, enthusiasts, and the specific subset of the population that has always been drawn to unusual psychoactive substances. The volumes were tiny, the community was niche, and no regulatory agency was paying attention. That changed slowly at first, then all at once. By the mid-2000s, kratom began appearing in head shops alongside herbal supplements and legal highs. Online vendors multiplied. Prices dropped as Indonesian kratom exports increased. The product was marketed vaguely as a botanical, a tea, something for aromatherapy, because nobody wanted to make explicit claims that would attract FDA scrutiny. The legal status was unclear in a way that felt like an invitation. Kratom occupied the same grey zone as countless other herbal products, not explicitly approved, not explicitly banned, existing in the regulatory space between food and drug that American law has never quite figured out how to handle. And then the opioid crisis exploded across America, and suddenly, millions of people in desperate circumstances discovered that there was a cheap, legal, widely available substance that could take the edge off opioid withdrawal, that could make chronic pain manageable, that could get a person through the day without a prescription, without a doctor, without insurance, without any of the systems that had already failed them. The quiet jungle tree had found its moment. What happened next was going to be anything but quiet. To understand why millions of Americans grabbed onto a jungle plant they'd never heard of before, you have to understand what was happening to them in the years leading up to it. Not the headline version of the opioid crisis, the one with the statistics and the congressional hearings, but the ground-level reality of what it actually felt like to live inside it. It started with a lie told by people wearing expensive suits in climate-controlled conference rooms. In the mid-1990s, Purdue Pharma launched OxyContin with an aggressive marketing campaign built on a single, simple and catastrophically false claim that their extended-release opioid formula was not addictive. Sales representatives fanned out across America and told this to doctors in every state. They gave gifts. They funded studies that supported their position. They targeted physicians in rural areas with high rates of physical labor, exactly the communities where chronic pain was most common and medical resources were most scarce. Within a few years, OxyContin had become one of the best-selling prescription medications in American history, and the country was swimming in opioids. The addiction followed the prescriptions with mathematical precision. Patients who'd been told they were taking a safe, non-addictive painkiller found themselves physically dependent within weeks. Doctors, many of whom had been genuinely misled, kept prescribing. Pharmacies kept filling. Families started noticing something was wrong with their relatives. The glassy eyes, the nodding off, the personality changes, but couldn't reconcile what they were seeing with a medication a licensed physician had provided. By the early 2000s, OxyContin abuse had become a full-scale epidemic in rural America. People were crushing the pills and snorting them, or dissolving them in water and injecting them, bypassing the extended release mechanism entirely. Purdue Pharma knew about this. Internal documents later revealed in litigation showed the company had received reports of abuse almost immediately after launch. They continued marketing anyway. Then, in 2010, Purdue reformulated OxyContin to make it harder to crush and abuse. On paper, this looked like a responsible corporate decision. In practice, it was a disaster. Millions of people who were physically dependent on OxyContin suddenly found that their supply had changed. The reformulated pills couldn't be crushed, they couldn't be injected, and the prescription crackdowns that followed the public health backlash made it increasingly difficult to get them at all. Doctors were threatened with DEA investigations, pain clinics were raided, prescribing rates dropped sharply. The patients didn't get less addicted, they just lost their supply. What happened next was entirely predictable to anyone paying attention, and apparently invisible to everyone who should have been. Hundreds of thousands of people dependent on prescription opioids turned to the street. Heroin was cheaper than diverted pills and far easier to obtain in most American cities. The heroin overdose rate began climbing almost immediately after the OxyContin reformulation. Researchers later published data showing the two trends lined up almost perfectly, a grim, irrefutable graph of cause and effect that the pharmaceutical industry and its political allies spent years trying to muddy. Then fentanyl arrived in the drug supply. Fentanyl is approximately 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine, and it began contaminating the illicit heroin supply around 2013. Drug dealers used it because it was cheap to produce, easy to transport, and could be mixed with heroin to stretch supply. The problem was dosing. Fentanyl is so potent that the difference between a dose that gets you high and a dose that stops your breathing is measured in micrograms, amounts invisible to the naked eye. Users had no way of knowing whether the powder they were buying contained heroin, fentanyl, a mix of both, or fentanyl analogues even more potent than fentanyl itself. Overdose deaths exploded. In 2016, opioids killed more than 42,000 Americans. In 2017, the number climbed to nearly 48,000. By 2021, it would exceed 80,000, more deaths in a single year than the entire Vietnam War. The communities hit hardest were exactly those that had been targeted by pharmaceutical marketing a decade earlier. Rural Appalachia, small manufacturing towns in the Midwest, communities where physical labour had been the economic backbone and chronic pain was an occupational reality rather than a complaint. Into this specific catastrophe, at this specific moment, Kratom walked through the door. The timing was not a coincidence, it was cause and effect. People who were dependent on opioids and suddenly cut off from their supply needed something that could manage withdrawal symptoms, the violent, destabilizing experience of opioid withdrawal that includes vomiting, muscle cramps, insomnia, anxiety so severe it feels like psychological collapse, and a physical desperation so overwhelming that people describe it as feeling like dying. Medical detox existed, but it required insurance, transportation, availability, and a willingness to enter a formal medical system that many people, for complicated reasons, didn't have access to or trust. Kratom required none of that. It was available online and shipped directly to your door. It cost roughly $30 to $50 for a month's supply at moderate doses. It was legal in most states, and, crucially, it actually worked well enough to matter. Users reported that Kratom reduced withdrawal symptoms to a manageable level, not eliminated them, but made the difference between being able to function and being curled on the bathroom floor. The online forums dedicated to opioid recovery began filling with Kratom testimonials starting around 2012 and accelerating dramatically through 2015 and 2016. The posts followed a consistent pattern. Someone described years of prescription opioid or heroin use, a failed attempt at quitting cold turkey, a desperate internet search, and then Kratom. Many described it as the first thing that had actually helped. Veterans posted about using it to manage chronic pain from combat injuries after being cut off from opioid prescriptions. Nurses described using it to get through shifts after developing physical dependence on medications they had access to at work. Mothers in suburban Ohio and West Virginia and Kentucky wrote about how Kratom had given them back the ability to get up in the morning and take their kids to school. None of these people were posting to a scientific journal. Their testimonials carried no methodological rigor. And yet the sheer volume of consistent reports, thousands of independent accounts describing similar benefits, constituted a kind of real-world evidence that clinical trials had not yet produced. When the FDA later argued that there was no evidence Kratom helped with opioid dependence, critics pointed directly at this body of lived experience and asked, with considerable frustration, why it didn't count. What nobody was talking about publicly in those early years was the other half of the story. The people who had started using Kratom to quit opioids and found, months later, that they couldn't stop using Kratom. The users who had traded one dependency for another, milder, yes, but real. The Kratom withdrawal that crept up on long-term users, the irritability, the sleeplessness, the low-grade physical discomfort that made stopping feel harder than expected. The forums contained those stories too, scattered between the testimonials of success. But in a crisis where the alternative was fentanyl, a mild physical dependency on a jungle leaf felt like a trade most people were willing to make. The federal government saw things differently. By 2014, the FDA had begun sending warning letters to Kratom vendors. By 2015, federal agents were seizing shipments. The agency's position was hardening. Kratom was not a dietary supplement, not an herbal remedy, not a food product. It was, in the FDA's view, an unapproved drug making implicit medical claims, and the entire industry selling it was operating outside the law. The Kratom community, watching federal agencies mobilize against the one thing that had pulled many of its members back from the edge of fentanyl, reacted with a fury that would soon force one of the most unusual confrontations in the history of American drug policy. The plant that farmers had chewed in Thai rice fields for centuries was about to become the centre of a political battle that nobody had seen coming, least of all the DEA. Most people, when they hear that kratom acts on opioid receptors, immediately picture heroin. That instinct is understandable and almost entirely wrong, but the reality is complicated enough that both the people defending kratom and the people trying to ban it can selectively use the same science to support completely opposite conclusions. Start with the basics. The human brain is riddled with opioid receptors, protein structures embedded in nerve cells that respond to the body's natural painkillers, endorphins, as well as to external opioid compounds. There are three main types: mu, delta, and kappa receptors. Mu receptors are the ones that matter most in this story. They control pain perception, mood, and, critically, breathing. When a classical opioid like morphine or heroin floods the brain, it binds aggressively to mu receptors and activates them fully. The result is pain relief, euphoria, sedation, and, at high enough doses, respiratory depression. The brain simply stops sending the signal to breathe. Mitragynine does something different. It binds to mu receptors, but it doesn't activate them with the same force. In pharmacology, this distinction has a name. Mitragynine is a partial agonist rather than a full agonist. Think of it like a dimmer switch versus a light switch. Mitragynine turns the receptor on, but only part way. Classical opioids slam it to maximum. This difference is not trivial. Partial agonism is precisely the mechanism behind buprenorphine, one of the most effective medications currently used to treat opioid use disorder. The same pharmacological principle that makes buprenorphine useful, activating opioid receptors enough to prevent withdrawal and craving without pushing them to the dangerous extreme, is what kratom's proponents argue makes mitragynine potentially valuable. The FDA, however, focused its attention on the other alkaloid. 7-hydroxymitragynine, the minor compound that makes up only about 2% of raw kratom leaf alkaloids, behaves with considerably less restraint. Studies suggest it is roughly 13 times more potent than morphine at mu receptors, and unlike mitragynine, it functions more like a full agonist. In a chewed leaf, the quantity is small enough to matter relatively little, but once kratom is extracted, concentrated or processed into the high-potency products that flooded the American market, the kratom shots, the ultra-concentrated extracts sold in little bottles at gas station counters, 7-hydroxymitragynine becomes the dominant player. And a dominant player with full agonist properties at opioid receptors is not something to wave away. This is the technical fault line that runs through every serious debate about kratom's safety. Raw leaf kratom and concentrated kratom extract are not the same product in any meaningful pharmacological sense. Treating them as identical in regulatory discussions is like treating beer and pure grain alcohol as the same substance, because they both contain ethanol. The chemistry is related. The risk profile is not. Beyond opioid receptors, mitragynine does something that classical opioids don't. At lower doses, it also activates adrenergic receptors, the same receptors that adrenaline targets. This is the mechanism behind kratom's stimulant effects. When mitragynine hits adrenergic receptors, it produces increased alertness, faster heart rate, and elevated energy. It also activates serotonin receptors in ways that may contribute to mood elevation. The result of this multi-receptor activity is the bizarre dual identity described in Part 1, a substance that is pharmacologically stimulant and opioid simultaneously, with the balance between those two effects shifting depending on the dose. What this means practically is that kratom's effect profile changes not just with the amount consumed, but with the individual. Body weight, metabolism, tolerance, and the specific alkaloid content of a given batch of kratom leaf all influence what a person actually experiences. Two people taking the same dose from the same bag can have meaningfully different experiences. This variability is part of what makes kratom genuinely difficult to study and genuinely dangerous to use without knowing what you're doing. Tolerance builds with regular kratom use, and it builds along the same pathways that opioid tolerance follows. The brain's opioid receptors downregulate. They become less sensitive and fewer in number as the brain tries to compensate for constant activation. This means users need progressively more kratom to achieve the same effect. It also means that stopping abruptly after prolonged use triggers a withdrawal response as the brain scrambles to rebalance itself in the substance's absence. Kratom withdrawal is real. This is not disputed by anyone who has seriously studied it. The symptoms map closely onto mild to moderate opioid withdrawal, muscle aches, sweating, insomnia, anxiety, irritability, nausea, and a specific maddening condition called restless leg syndrome. The sensation that your legs need to move constantly, making sleep impossible. Most accounts describe kratom withdrawal as lasting 5 to 10 days for the acute physical phase, followed by weeks of psychological discomfort, low mood, difficulty experiencing pleasure, a persistent sense that something is missing. Critically, kratom withdrawal has never been documented as directly fatal. Classical opioid withdrawal is also rarely directly fatal in otherwise healthy adults, though it can be in medically vulnerable individuals. But kratom's withdrawal profile appears genuinely milder, shorter duration, lower intensity, without some of the more severe symptoms that accompany heavy fentanyl or heroin dependence. Whether that makes it safe depends entirely on what you're comparing it to. Compared to fentanyl withdrawal, kratom withdrawal is a minor inconvenience. Compared to stopping coffee, it is a meaningful medical experience. The brain also processes kratom differently than synthetic opioids in one additional, poorly understood way. Several studies have suggested that mitragynine may engage a signaling pathway called beta-arrestin recruitment differently than classical opioids. The significance of this is considerable. Beta-arrestin signaling is associated with many of the most dangerous opioid side effects, including respiratory depression and constipation. Some researchers have proposed that mitragynine's different interaction with this pathway explains why kratom appears to cause significantly less respiratory depression than equinalgesic doses of morphine. If accurate, this would represent a genuine pharmacological advantage, a compound that provides pain relief and opioid-like effects without triggering the mechanism that kills people in overdose. The word "if" is carrying enormous weight in that sentence. The research is preliminary. Most of it was conducted in animals. Human data is sparse and methodologically inconsistent. Scientists who specialize in opioid pharmacology are genuinely divided. Some consider the beta-arrestin hypothesis promising enough to pursue seriously. Others think it's been oversold based on limited evidence. The honest answer is that nobody knows for certain yet, because the research needed to answer the question definitively has not been done at scale. And the reason that research hasn't been done at scale brings the story back around to policy. Federal funding for kratom research has been throttled by the same regulatory uncertainty that makes everything else about kratom complicated. Institutional review boards are reluctant to approve human studies involving a substance with unclear legal status. Researchers who have applied for NIH grants to study kratom have described a bureaucratic tangle that makes standard drug research look straightforward by comparison. The science cannot catch up to the public health reality because the system governing that science is paralyzed by the same unresolved question it needs the science to answer. Meanwhile, The brain keeps doing what brains do: adapting, craving, compensating. Millions of Americans were using Kratom daily by the mid-2000s, and most of them had no idea what the alkaloids in their morning tea were actually doing to their neural architecture. They knew it worked. They knew that stopping was harder than they'd expected. They knew that the government seemed to want to take it away, and they were about to find out exactly how far that government was willing to go. On August 30th, 2016, the Drug Enforcement Administration published a notice in the Federal Register that sent a shockwave through an already fractured American drug policy landscape. The agency announced its intention to place Kratom, both mitragynine and 7-hydroxymitragynine, into Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act on an emergency basis. Schedule 1 is the most restrictive category in American drug law. It designates a substance as having no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. The other residents of Schedule 1 include heroin, LSD, peyote, and ecstasy. The DEA was not proposing a debate. It was not opening a comment period. It was announcing that in 30 days, possessing Kratom would carry the same federal legal consequences as possessing heroin. 30 days. The Kratom community had 1 month to respond to a decision that would criminalize the daily routine of an estimated 3 to 5 million Americans. Most regulatory scheduling processes take years, involve extensive public comment periods, and require documented scientific review. Emergency scheduling bypasses all of that. It is a mechanism designed for situations where an immediate public health threat demands instant action. The kind of tool created for when a new synthetic drug is killing people at emergency rooms across the country, before regulators can even finish their paperwork. The DEA had decided that Kratom, a plant used in Southeast Asia for centuries, sold openly in American stores for over a decade, constituted exactly that kind of emergency. The response was unlike anything the agency had encountered before. Within days of the announcement, the American Kratom Association and dozens of independent advocacy groups mobilized an organizing campaign that moved at a speed that even its participants found surprising. Online forums coordinated mass letter-writing efforts targeting congressional offices. Veterans organizations, groups that the DEA and FDA could not easily dismiss as fringe activists, released formal statements opposing the scheduling. Chronic pain advocacy groups followed. Opioid recovery communities, many of whose members had used Kratom as a bridge away from more dangerous substances, generated thousands of individual testimonials directed at federal agencies and elected officials. The congressional response was unprecedented for a drug scheduling dispute. 51 members of the House of Representatives signed a letter to the DEA formally requesting that the agency withdraw its emergency scheduling notice and pursue the standard, lengthy review process instead. Senators added their voices. The political pressure came from both sides of the aisle, a genuine bipartisan alignment that reflected how broadly Kratom use had spread across demographic and geographic lines. Rural Republican districts where veterans and chronic pain patients used Kratom. Urban Democratic districts where opioid recovery communities had adopted it. The DEA had stumbled into a constituency that crossed every political boundary it might have expected to use as cover. 6 weeks after its initial announcement, the DEA did something it almost never does. It backed down. The agency withdrew the emergency scheduling notice in October 2016 and announced it would open a formal public comment period instead. Over 23,000 comments were submitted, the vast majority opposing Schedule 1 placement. Researchers submitted scientific objections to the DEA's methodology. The FDA was asked to conduct a formal medical and scientific review. The Kratom community declared victory, and for a brief period, it felt like the regulatory machinery might actually slow down long enough to let the science catch up. That optimism lasted approximately 18 months. In 2017, Scott Gottlieb was confirmed as FDA Commissioner, and the agency's approach to Kratom immediately hardened into something more aggressive and more technically sophisticated than the DEA's blunt scheduling attempt. Gottlieb's FDA did not move to simply ban Kratom. Instead, it deployed a computational analysis tool called the Public Health Assessment via Structural Evaluation, phase, to argue, algorithmically, that Kratom's alkaloids functioned as opioids and should be regulated as such. The phase system used molecular modeling to compare Kratom's alkaloids to known opioid compounds. The FDA published its findings with considerable fanfare in February 2018, announcing that the analysis demonstrated Kratom had opioid properties and presenting this as if it were a novel and damning discovery. The scientific community reacted with poorly concealed bewilderment. Researchers who had studied Kratom pointed out that mitragynine's opioid receptor activity had been documented in peer-reviewed literature for years. It was not a secret the FDA had uncovered, it was a starting point that everyone already knew. Using a structural modeling algorithm to identify receptor binding properties said nothing about clinical risk, addiction potential, or whether Kratom actually functioned like a dangerous opioid in human beings at the doses people were using it. Several prominent pharmacologists published formal critiques of the phase analysis. The main objection was methodological. The tool was designed to flag structural similarities, not to assess real-world safety. By the same logic, buprenorphine, the FDA-approved addiction treatment medication, would also register as an opioid requiring restriction, because it is one, and it binds the same receptors. The analysis could not distinguish between a compound that helped people and a compound that killed them, because it wasn't designed to make that distinction. It was designed to categorize, and categorization is not the same as risk assessment. The FDA did not revise its position. Instead, it escalated. The agency began publishing increasingly alarming public statements about Kratom, citing a database of adverse event reports that included deaths allegedly linked to the substance. The number attached to those deaths, eventually reaching 44 cases, circulated widely in news coverage. The Kratom community and independent researchers immediately examined the underlying case reports and found something the FDA's press releases did not highlight. The overwhelming majority of those deaths involved multiple substances simultaneously: alcohol, benzodiazepines, other opioids. In case after case, Kratom was present alongside compounds with well-established lethal potential, and the determination that Kratom had caused or contributed to the death was, at minimum, debatable. But the number was already in the headlines. Corrections never travel as far as initial claims. What made the FDA's campaign particularly effective and particularly infuriating to Kratom advocates was its timing relative to the opioid crisis narrative. Every press release about Kratom deaths arrived against a backdrop of genuine, documented mass death from synthetic opioids. The agency was not wrong that opioids were killing Americans at a staggering rate. It was not wrong that unregulated substances carried risks. But by consistently framing Kratom within the opioid crisis narrative, rather than as a potential harm reduction tool operating within that crisis, the FDA effectively recruited the moral urgency of 80,000 annual overdose deaths to support a campaign against a substance with a radically different risk profile. The Kratom community watched this rhetorical maneuver with a specific kind of fury that comes from watching your lifeline being characterized as your threat. People who had used Kratom to exit fentanyl dependency found their own stories weaponized in reverse, their former addiction cited as evidence of danger, their recovery tool characterized as the next step down the same path. The argument was not just scientifically questionable. To many users, It felt like a profound and personal betrayal by the institutions that were supposed to protect them, and underneath all of it, invisible to most of the people involved in the public battle, a different set of interests was watching the whole conflict with very close attention. The pharmaceutical industry had noticed what Kratom's alkaloids could do. Companies with the resources to conduct proper clinical trials, file patents, and navigate the FDA approval process were quietly studying mitragynine derivatives. If those studies succeeded, if a pharmaceutical company could create a kratom-derived compound, patent it, and bring it through FDA approval, the same agency that had been fighting kratom as a dangerous unregulated drug would potentially approve a modified version of its active ingredient as a prescription medication. The plant that couldn't be patented would be banned. The molecule that could be would be sold at a premium. The irony was so perfectly structured that it barely needed pointing out, and yet almost nobody in the mainstream coverage of the Kratom Wars mentioned it at all. While federal agencies were locked in a regulatory war over Kratom's legal status, something else was happening simultaneously, something that received almost no attention in the mainstream coverage, and yet shaped the real-world risk profile of Kratom more directly than any DEA scheduling decision ever could. An industry was being built, fast, chaotic, almost completely unregulated, and generating serious money. The Kratom market in the United States grew from a niche internet curiosity into a multi-$100 million industry in roughly 5 years. By 2016, the American Kratom Association estimated retail sales somewhere between $300 and $500 million annually. By 2020, independent market analysts placed the figure above $1 billion. The growth curve looked less like a herbal supplement market and more like a tech startup, explosive, disorganized, and attracting exactly the kind of operators who thrive when rules haven't been written yet. The legal mechanism that made this possible was one of the oldest tricks in the American alternative substance playbook: sell it as something other than what it is. Kratom vendors labeled their products as botanical specimens, tea, not for human consumption, or simply avoided any labeling that implied medicinal use. This was not a loophole that Kratom's industry invented. It was the same strategy that had sustained the bath salts industry, the synthetic cannabinoid market, and dozens of other grey zone substance markets before and after. American consumer protection law creates enormous regulatory space between food and drug, and entrepreneurs have been exploiting that space creatively for decades. The not-for-human consumption label is particularly elegant in its audacity. A vendor selling powdered kratom in capsule form, the capsule being one of the most recognizable indicators of intentional human consumption ever designed, could print "not for human consumption" on the packaging, and thereby, in theory, avoid FDA jurisdiction over drug claims. In practice, the FDA saw through this immediately, but fighting it product by product, vendor by vendor, across an industry that had thousands of participants and operated primarily online, required resources and coordination that the agency struggled to deploy consistently. Distribution spread in 2 parallel directions simultaneously. Online, Kratom became available through hundreds of dedicated vendors whose websites range from polished and professional to barely functional. Customers could browse dozens of strain varieties, names like Mangda, Bali, Green Malay, Red Borneo, each with different claimed effects, different alkaloid profiles, and wildly different quality. The online market operated on testimonials, forum recommendations, and the kind of decentralized word of mouth that pre-internet underground markets would have required years to build. Amazon briefly sold Kratom products before removing them. Etsy hosted Kratom vendors. The substance moved through e-commerce infrastructure designed for craft goods and vintage clothing, with zero friction and almost zero oversight. On the physical retail side, Kratom colonized a specific commercial ecosystem: smoke shops, vape stores, head shops, and, most visibly, gas stations. The gas station Kratom product became its own cultural artifact. Small plastic bottles containing concentrated Kratom extract, marketed with names that gestured vaguely toward energy and wellness, appeared in the same display cases as 5-hour energy shots and CBD gummies. Truck stops across the American South and Midwest stocked them. Convenience stores in rural areas where pain clinics had recently been shut down suddenly had Kratom on the counter next to the lottery tickets. The gas station products represented a specific and significant escalation in risk. Unlike loose powder Kratom, which users measured by the teaspoon and which contain the alkaloid concentrations found naturally in Kratom leaf, the extract products were concentrated. The 7-hydroxymetragenine content in a single Kratom shot could exceed what a person would consume from several tablespoons of standard leaf powder. These were the products most likely to produce effects resembling classical opioid intoxication. These were also the products most accessible to people with no prior Kratom experience: the curious teenager, the person in acute withdrawal reaching for anything within arm's reach, the user who assumed that because it was sold next to energy drinks, it probably had a similar risk profile. Quality control across the industry was essentially non-existent. This was not a minor operational detail. It was a fundamental safety problem that caused real harm to real people. Without regulatory standards, Kratom products varied dramatically in potency even within the same strain and vendor. A batch of powder that tested at 1 alkaloid concentration in January might test at twice that concentration in March, because the alkaloids in Kratom leaves vary naturally with growing conditions, harvest timing, and processing method. Users who had calibrated their doses based on one batch could inadvertently overdose on the next. More seriously, independent laboratory testing of commercial Kratom products, conducted by researchers at institutions including the FDA itself, repeatedly found contamination issues that had nothing to do with Kratom's own pharmacology. Heavy metals were a recurring problem. Lead, nickel, and cadmium appeared in multiple tested products at concentrations above safe limits. The contamination came from growing soil, processing equipment, or the mixing of Kratom with other materials by unscrupulous vendors. Salmonella contamination triggered a multi-state outbreak in 2018, eventually linked to Kratom products distributed by a single supplier. The FDA issued a voluntary recall. The outbreak infected nearly 200 people across 41 states, not from Kratom's alkaloids, but from basic food safety failures that regulated pharmaceutical manufacturing would have prevented entirely. The most alarming contamination cases involved adulteration, products that contained not just Kratom, but additional substances added deliberately or accidentally during processing. Independent testing services identified products containing hydrocodone, a prescription opioid with clear abuse potential and significant overdose risk. Others tested positive for phenylethylamine, a stimulant compound that can cause dangerous cardiovascular effects. Some products appeared to contain synthetic opioid compounds that had no business being in a botanical supplement. These were not cases of Kratom being dangerous. They were cases of fraud, where the substance being sold was not actually the substance on the label. The harm from these adulterated products was attributed to Kratom in public health databases because Kratom was what the label said. Every emergency room visit, every adverse event report, every data point the FDA later compiled about Kratom-related hospitalizations existed in a system that had no reliable mechanism for distinguishing between harm caused by Kratom's actual alkaloids and harm caused by whatever had been mixed into a particular batch by a supplier in a warehouse somewhere in rural Georgia or rural Indonesia. the Kratom advocacy community understood this problem acutely. The American Kratom Association had been pushing for something called the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, a framework of regulations that would require age verification for purchase, mandatory laboratory testing of products, accurate labeling of alkaloid content, and prohibition of adulterated products. The argument was straightforward. Proper regulation would make Kratom safer, not more dangerous. The people most harmed by the unregulated market were Kratom users themselves. Several states took that argument seriously. Utah became the first state to pass a version of the Kratom Consumer Protection Act in 2019. Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada followed. In those states, the Wild West dynamic began shifting towards something resembling an actual regulated market, with lab testing requirements, age restrictions, and vendor accountability. But in Washington, the regulatory approach remained stuck in the binary logic of ban or don't ban, with no serious federal effort to build the middle ground that the state-level laws were attempting to construct. The FDA continued treating all Kratom as equivalent regardless of concentration, source, or purity. The DEA remained in a holding pattern, and the vendors who had no interest in testing, labeling, or responsible business practices continued operating freely in the states where no consumer protection framework existed. The gold rush mentality that had built this industry in 5 years was not going away voluntarily. There was too much money, too little enforcement, and too many customers who needed the product badly enough that they would buy it regardless of what the label said or didn't say. And somewhere in that chaotic, unregulated, contaminated, occasionally adulterated market, real people were trying to manage real pain with the best available option they could find. Some of them were about to become statistics. And what those statistics actually meant would become one of the most fiercely contested questions in the entire Kratom debate. In February 2018, the FDA released a number that landed in American newsrooms like a grenade. 44 deaths, the agency announced, had been linked to Kratom. The figure appeared in headlines across every major outlet within hours. Cable news ran segments. Senators cited it in floor speeches. The story wrote itself. Dangerous, unregulated substance linked to dozens of deaths. Federal agency demands action. By the time the nuance caught up, if it caught up at all, the damage to public perception was permanent. The number was real. The interpretation was a different matter entirely. Researchers who examined the underlying case reports, the actual documented evidence behind each of the 44 deaths, found a picture that looked almost nothing like the headline suggested. The FDA's own data, when read carefully rather than summarized, told a story of extreme complexity. In the vast majority of cases, Kratom was not the only substance present in the deceased system. Multiple other drugs appeared consistently: benzodiazepines, which depress respiratory function, alcohol, which compounds the sedative effects of almost anything, fentanyl and other opioids, which are independently capable of causing death at relatively small doses. In case after case, the determination that Kratom had contributed to the death was based on its presence in a toxicology report alongside substances with well-established, independently sufficient lethal potential. Toxicology is not causation. Finding a substance in someone's system proves they consumed it. It does not prove the substance killed them. Medical examiners determine cause of death through a combination of toxicology, autopsy findings, medical history, and professional judgment. And that judgment, when multiple substances are involved, inevitably involves uncertainty. The Kratom community pointed this out repeatedly, methodically, and with considerable documentary evidence. The FDA did not revise its public statements. The genuinely ambiguous cases were a small subset, perhaps 5 to 8 deaths, where Kratom was either the sole substance identified or where the combination of substances made its role plausible rather than merely possible. Within that subset, several involved concentrated kratom extract products rather than standard leaf kratom, bringing the adulteration and concentration problems from Part 5 directly into the mortality discussion. Others involved individuals with pre-existing cardiac conditions, a population for which kratom's adrenergic stimulant effects at higher doses could plausibly create cardiovascular risk. None of this made kratom harmless. It made the evidence genuinely complicated. And genuinely complicated evidence is the enemy of clean regulatory narratives. To understand how strange the FDA's framing was, consider the comparison that kratom advocates made constantly, and that regulators consistently declined to engage with seriously. Acetaminophen, Tylenol, causes approximately 500 deaths per year in the United States, the majority from accidental overdose. It is sold without prescription in every pharmacy, grocery store, and gas station in the country, in quantities large enough to cause fatal liver damage if taken incorrectly. NSAIDs, the category that includes ibuprofen and naproxen, kill an estimated 16,000 Americans annually through gastrointestinal bleeding and cardiovascular events. Alcohol causes approximately 95,000 deaths per year in the United States, across direct and indirect causes. 44 deaths over multiple years, in cases where multiple substances were involved, placed next to those numbers, looks different. Not harmless, different. The FDA was not applying a consistent risk threshold. It was applying a specific kind of scrutiny to a specific substance, while leaving structurally similar risks from legal substances entirely unexamined. The agency's defenders argued that this was justified by kratom's opioid receptor activity and abuse potential. Its critics argued that the standard was being selectively applied to produce a predetermined conclusion. The cardiac risk question was particularly thorny, and received far less public attention than the overdose debate. Several published case reports documented serious cardiac arrhythmias in kratom users, abnormal heart rhythms that in some cases required medical intervention. Mitragynine had been shown in laboratory studies to interact with cardiac ion channels in ways that could theoretically affect heart rhythm, particularly in individuals with pre-existing cardiac conditions or in combination with other substances affecting the same pathways. This was not a fabricated concern. It was a genuine pharmacological signal that warranted investigation. What it warranted was research. What it received instead was incorporation into a regulatory argument that treated preliminary signals as established conclusions. The difference between "this compound shows a signal that requires investigation" and "this compound causes dangerous cardiac events" is the difference between science and advocacy. The FDA was consistently presenting the former as the latter, and the kratom community's blanket dismissal of all safety concerns, a defensive reaction born from years of watching legitimate concerns weaponized, was creating a mirror image of the same problem on the opposite side. The debate had stopped being about evidence. It had become about territory. Meanwhile, something was happening in the data that almost nobody was discussing. The overdose crisis continued escalating throughout the period when kratom use was also increasing dramatically. If kratom were functioning as a meaningful harm reduction tool at population scale, pulling users away from fentanyl and other deadly opioids, one might expect to see some statistical signal in overdose mortality data for populations with high kratom use. Researchers attempted to examine this question, and the results were suggestive but far from conclusive. States with legal kratom showed slightly different opioid mortality trend lines than states where kratom was banned, but confounding variables made clean interpretation nearly impossible. The harm reduction argument for kratom, the argument that despite its risks, it was saving lives by providing an alternative to more dangerous substances, rested not on epidemiological proof, but on the same mechanism of action logic that makes methadone and buprenorphine credible treatment options. Partial opioid agonists reduce cravings and withdrawal symptoms, while carrying lower overdose risk than full agonists. If that principle holds for buprenorphine, advocates asked, why does the same logic not apply to mitragynine? The answer from regulators was never fully stated but clearly implied. Because buprenorphine goes through clinical trials and FDA approval, and Kratom does not. The safety is not the issue. The control is. That distinction became impossible to ignore when the pharmaceutical angle crystallized. In 2019 and 2020, academic papers began appearing that examined mitragynine derivatives, slightly modified versions of the natural alkaloid, that appeared to retain the pain-relieving and anti-addiction properties while reducing side effects. Researchers at Columbia University and other institutions published findings suggesting that certain mitragynine analogues could represent a genuinely novel class of opioid alternatives. Patent filings followed. The scientific language shifted from dangerous unregulated herb to promising pharmaceutical scaffold. The molecule that the FDA had spent years describing as indistinguishable from heroin was being quietly repositioned as the potential basis for the next generation of addiction medicine. The plant it came from remained illegal in 6 states. The researchers pursuing its pharmaceutical derivatives were operating through institutions that had FDA funding and FDA cooperation. Nobody formally acknowledged the contradiction. Nobody needed to. The system was working exactly as designed, filtering out the unownable, uncontrollable, unpatentable version of a compound, while creating the conditions under which the ownable, controllable, patentable version could advance through official channels. The 44 deaths remained in the headlines. The patent filings remained in the footnotes, and across America, in apartments and trailers and suburban houses, people who had never heard of mitragynine analogues or pharmaceutical scaffolds or beta-arrestin signaling kept measuring out their daily dose of kratom powder, doing their own cost-benefit analysis with the information available to them and trying to get through the day. The statistics and the regulatory battles and the congressional letters existed in a world of abstractions. The people using kratom did not. They existed in specific places, with specific histories, making decisions under specific pressures that no federal agency press release ever managed to accurately describe. 3 trajectories in particular capture the full, unresolved complexity of what kratom actually did to actual human lives, not as data points, but as the kind of messy, non-linear stories that resist being turned into either cautionary tales or triumph narratives. The first trajectory belonged to a type of person the VA system had failed in ways that were both systematic and deeply personal. Combat veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan faced a pain management crisis that predated the opioid epidemic, but became catastrophically entangled with it. Traumatic injuries, the kind produced by IED blasts, shrapnel, the cumulative physical destruction of years of carrying heavy equipment over brutal terrain, created chronic pain conditions that military medicine treated aggressively with opioid prescriptions throughout the 2000s. The VA became one of the largest distributors of prescription opioids in the country during that period, prescribing at rates that civilian physicians would eventually be investigated for. Then the crackdown came, and the prescription stopped, and the pain didn't. Veterans in this situation, and there were tens of thousands of them, were simultaneously dealing with chronic physical pain, the psychological weight of PTSD, and the physiological reality of opioid dependence, all while navigating a VA system overwhelmed, understaffed, and chronically slow to respond to individual cases. Many turned to kratom not as recreation, and not as addiction, but as functional necessity. A veteran managing a spinal injury, nerve damage in both legs, and intrusive PTSD symptoms, who found that 4 grams of kratom in the morning allowed him to get out of bed, drive, and function without the sedating fog of prescription opioids was not making a reckless choice. He was making the only choice available to him that didn't involve either constant debilitating pain or pharmaceutical dependence under medical supervision that had already failed him. These users tended to be disciplined about their kratom use in ways that the general population was not. They measured doses carefully. They tracked their tolerance. They deliberately rotated kratom-free days to prevent escalating dependence. The online veteran communities developed detailed harm reduction protocols that circulated widely, practical, detailed, calibrated guides to using kratom sustainably that contained more actionable safety information than anything the FDA ever published. The irony was acute. The people the government had most thoroughly failed were now producing the most responsible guidance on managing the substance the government wanted to ban. The second trajectory looked almost identical from the outside and completely different from the inside. A young woman, representative of a demographic that appeared repeatedly in kratom recovery communities, had started using heroin at 19 after becoming dependent on pain medication following a car accident. The path from prescription opioids to street drugs was by then so well documented it had its own name in public health literature, the prescription to illicit pipeline. By her mid-20s she had attempted detox 3 times, completed 2 inpatient programs, relapsed on fentanyl-contaminated heroin twice after discharge, and lost most of the social infrastructure, job, apartment, family trust that makes sustained recovery possible. Kratom entered her life through an online recovery forum. The report she read described it as a tool for managing the transition off opioids, something to reduce cravings and withdrawal symptoms during the critical first weeks when relapse rates are highest. She used it that way, and it worked, in the narrow sense that she stopped using heroin. The broader sense was more complicated. Within 8 months she was consuming between 15 and 20 grams of kratom daily, well above the doses that produce opioid-like effects, sustained across multiple doses throughout the day. She had not relapsed onto heroin, but she was also not free. The kratom held her in a functional state that looked like recovery from the outside, employed, housed, reconnecting with family, while internally she was managing a physical dependency that structured her entire day around the next dose. Skipping a dose produced anxiety so severe it interfered with work. Going 12 hours without kratom produced physical symptoms she described as indistinguishable from mild heroin withdrawal. She eventually tapered off kratom over a period of 4 months, using a slow reduction protocol she assembled herself from online sources, because no formal medical guidance existed for kratom tapering in her area. The process was unpleasant, prolonged, and genuinely difficult, harder than she had expected based on kratom's reputation as a mild dependency. She emerged from it clean of both substances and deeply ambivalent about what kratom had actually done for her. It had unquestionably pulled her away from fentanyl. It had also kept her in a dependency framework for nearly a year longer than she had realized, and the transition out of it had required the same kind of disciplined, supported effort that proper addiction medicine would have provided from the beginning, if proper addiction medicine had been accessible to her, which it hadn't been. Her story was not a kratom horror story. It was not a kratom success story. It was what most kratom stories actually were, a harm reduction that created its own harm, a net calculation that came out positive but not cleanly so, a life improved but not fixed by a substance that the systems around her were entirely unprepared to help her use wisely or exit gracefully. The third trajectory came from the chronic pain world rather than the addiction world, and it illustrated a different dimension of the problem entirely. A middle-aged man, a former construction worker with degenerative disc disease and bilateral knee damage accumulated over 2 decades of physical labour, had been managing his pain with a combination of prescription NSAIDs and occasional opioid prescriptions until his gastroenterologist delivered a blunt ultimatum. The NSAID use had caused significant gastrointestinal damage, and continuing at current doses would eventually produce bleeding serious enough to be life-threatening. His primary care physician, navigating the post-crackdown opioid prescribing environment with extreme caution, was unwilling to increase his opioid prescription to compensate. The pain management specialist he was referred to had a 4-month waiting list. He found Kratom through a co-worker and began using 6 to 8 grams of powdered leaf twice daily. The relief was, by his description, transformative, not euphoric, not sedating, but functional. He could work a modified schedule, he could sleep, he could walk without the grinding, constant pain that had been making him consider disability paperwork before retirement age. He understood it wasn't a cure. He understood that he was physically dependent on it, and that stopping would be unpleasant. He considered that an acceptable trade-off compared to either constant severe pain or gastrointestinal hemorrhage. Then his state moved toward Kratom prohibition. The proposed ban gave him 90 days to find an alternative. He returned to his doctor, who offered an opioid prescription that carried its own dependency implications and the same prescribing environment pressures that had previously constrained his care. The pain specialist still had a waiting list. The gastroenterologist had no additional recommendations. He was, in practical terms, being pushed by a regulatory decision made by people who had never met him, based on population-level data that didn't reflect his specific situation, toward medical options that were either unavailable or carried risks equivalent to or greater than what he was already managing. His situation had no clean resolution because the system offered none. He was not the FDA's target. He was its collateral consequence, the person for whom the unregulated market had provided something the regulated market couldn't, and for whom prohibition didn't eliminate the need, only the legal means of meeting it. These 3 lives shared a single structural feature that transcended their individual circumstances. Each person had arrived at Kratom through a gap, a place where medical systems, regulatory frameworks, and social support structures had failed to provide what they needed. The veteran's gap was a VA system that prescribed recklessly and then withdrew abruptly. The young woman's gap was an addiction treatment infrastructure too underfunded and inaccessible to catch her during her most vulnerable periods. The construction worker's gap was a pain management system that had overcorrected from opioid permissiveness to opioid restriction without building adequate alternatives in between. Kratom had not created any of those gaps. It had simply occupied them. And the debate about whether to ban, regulate, or ignore Kratom was, at its most fundamental level, a debate about what happens to the people living in those gaps when the thing filling them gets taken away. The answer was not mysterious. It had already been observed in real time when OxyContin was reformulated and the patients who depended on it moved to heroin. The same dynamic, the same population pressures, the same desperate arithmetic of pain and dependency and inadequate alternatives, just with different substances substituted into the same structural positions. Understanding that pattern required looking at the evidence honestly and completely. And the evidence, scientific, epidemiological, human, was considerably more complicated than either side of the Kratom debate was willing to publicly admit. The scientific literature on Kratom, as of the mid-2000s, is a document of institutional failure as much as it is a body of knowledge. Not because researchers aren't trying. Some genuinely excellent scientists have devoted significant portions of their careers to understanding this plant, but because the systems that fund, approve, and publish research have treated kratom as a political problem rather than a scientific question, and the knowledge base reflects that distortion at every level. Start with the numbers. A search of PubMed, the primary database for biomedical research, returns a few hundred published studies on kratom and its alkaloids. Compare that to, say, buprenorphine, which has thousands of published studies accumulated over decades of FDA-approved research. Or compare it to cannabis, which, despite its own complicated regulatory history, has generated a research base orders of magnitude larger than kratom's. The disparity is not because kratom is a new substance. It has been known to Western pharmacology since the 19th century. It is because the regulatory environment surrounding kratom has made meaningful research structurally difficult in ways that compound over time. Federal funding is the central bottleneck. The National Institutes of Health has funded some kratom research, a meaningful development, and one that the kratom advocacy community treated as a significant victory when it occurred. But the scale of that funding relative to the public health question being asked is wildly insufficient. Researchers who have submitted grant applications describing rigorous clinical studies of kratom's effects in human subjects have described review processes complicated by the substance's ambiguous legal status. Study designs that would be straightforward for any FDA-approved compound become entangled in institutional review board deliberations about whether approving research involving a potentially Schedule I substance creates institutional liability. The result is a specific kind of knowledge gap, one that is not randomly distributed across the questions that matter, but is systematically concentrated in exactly the areas where answers are most urgently needed. Animal studies are easier to fund and approve than human studies, so the literature is disproportionately built on rodent models. Short-term effects are easier to study than long-term effects, so chronic use data is sparse. Case reports of adverse events are easier to publish than controlled outcome studies, so the published record skews toward harm signals, while the question of net benefit remains largely unaddressed. The animal research that does exist paints a picture of genuine duality. Studies in rodents have shown that mitragynine produces pain relief, reduces withdrawal symptoms in opioid-dependent animals, and causes less respiratory depression than equianalgesic doses of morphine, findings consistent with the partial agonist pharmacology described in Part 3. The same animal literature shows that chronic high-dose administration produces tolerance, physical dependence, and liver enzyme elevations in some models. Neither the benefits nor the risks extrapolate cleanly from rodents to humans. They never do. But the animal data at least establishes a biological plausibility framework for both the therapeutic claims and the safety concerns. The liver question deserves specific attention because it has been almost entirely absent from mainstream kratom coverage, despite representing one of the more substantiated safety signals in the literature. Multiple published case reports have documented a condition called kratom-associated hepatotoxicity, liver damage, in plain language, in individuals who are using kratom regularly and had no other identified cause of liver injury. The cases have generally been reversible. Liver function returned to normal after kratom cessation, but some required medical intervention, and the pattern was consistent enough across independent case reports to constitute a genuine signal rather than statistical noise. The mechanism is not fully understood. Some researchers have proposed that specific alkaloids or impurities in commercial kratom products interact with liver enzymes in ways that produce toxicity in susceptible individuals. Others have suggested that the hepatotoxicity cases cluster around concentrated extract products rather than standard leaf preparations, connecting the risk back to the processing and concentration problem that runs through the entire kratom safety discussion. What is clear is that kratom is not metabolically inert. It engages the liver's cytochrome P450 enzyme system in ways that affect both its own metabolism and the metabolism of other substances taken simultaneously, creating drug interaction risks that have received almost no systematic study. The drug interaction problem is particularly relevant given the population most likely to use kratom. People managing chronic pain or opioid recovery are often taking multiple substances, prescription medications, other supplements, alcohol at varying rates. Mitragynine interference with CYP3A4 and CYP2, D6 enzymes, the same enzymes that process many common medications, means that kratom can alter the effective blood levels of antidepressants, benzodiazepines, and other opioids in ways that users and their physicians are almost certainly not anticipating. Several of the multi-substance death cases in the FDA's database involved combinations where kratom's enzyme inhibition could plausibly have elevated the blood concentration of a co-administered substance to dangerous levels, not by direct opioid effect, but by metabolic interference. This is precisely the kind of mechanistic insight that proper clinical pharmacology research would clarify. It is also precisely the kind of research that the current funding and regulatory environment makes difficult to conduct at adequate scale. The quality of what research does exist faces an additional problem beyond funding: the supply chain itself. Academic researchers studying kratom need standardized, characterized samples, material with known, verified alkaloid content that allows different laboratories to compare results meaningfully. In a regulated pharmaceutical context, this is routine. For kratom, it requires either obtaining samples from commercial vendors with all the quality control problems documented in Part 5, or synthesizing pure alkaloids in the laboratory, which is expensive and produces results that may not reflect what people are actually consuming. Studies conducted with pure synthetic mitragynine tell you about that specific compound. They tell you considerably less about the complex alkaloid mixture in a bag of commercial Mengda powder. Several researchers have noted that kratom leaf contains over 40 identified alkaloids beyond the two primary ones, and the interactions between those minor alkaloids are essentially unstudied. The entourage effect, the phenomenon whereby multiple plant compounds interact to produce effects different from any single compound in isolation, is a well-documented principle in cannabis pharmacology and a reasonable hypothesis for kratom as well. Studying it properly requires resources and regulatory cooperation that the current environment does not provide. Against this backdrop of genuine scientific uncertainty, pharmaceutical interest has been quietly intensifying. The work at Columbia University and affiliated institutions that began generating patents in the late 2000s accelerated into the early 2000s, with several published papers describing mitragynine pseudoindoxil, a modified mitragynine derivative, as a potentially transformative compound in opioid pharmacology. The derivative retained analgesic potency while showing dramatically reduced side effects in animal models, including, critically, reduced physical dependence and reduced respiratory depression. The research was genuinely exciting, the methodology substantially more rigorous than most kratom studies, and the implications potentially enormous. The irony embedded in this development was so complete it almost required no comment. The federal government had spent years arguing that kratom was too dangerous and too poorly understood to remain unscheduled. The same federal research infrastructure had simultaneously, through NIH and academic partnerships, been funding the science that was turning kratom's primary alkaloid into a pharmaceutical candidate. The researchers pursuing the derivative were careful to distinguish their work from kratom advocacy. They were studying a modified compound, not the plant, but the molecule they were modifying was the same molecule the FDA had flagged as an opioid threat. Cleaned up, modified and run through the approval process, it might eventually reach the market as a prescription medication. The patent protection that pharmaceutical development provides would ensure that the eventual product cost orders of magnitude more than the kratom powder it derived from. The populations who'd been using the unpatentable version, the veterans, the chronic pain patients, the opioid recovery community, would have access to the pharmaceutical version only through the insurance and prescription systems that many of them had already found inaccessible. The plant would remain banned or grey market in much of the country. The derivative would be approved. Nobody in any official capacity described this as a problem. The system was not designed to notice it as one. What the system was designed to do, eventually imperfectly slowly, was generate enough regulated knowledge to force a decision. The FDA's own roadmap for kratom, published in various forms over the years, consistently pointed toward clinical trials as the path to any legitimate regulatory status. Submit an investigational new drug application, conduct phase 1, 2, and 3 trials, demonstrate safety and efficacy through the standard process. The kratom advocacy community's response to this was consistent. That pathway costs between $1 and $2 billion, requires a decade of development, and is designed for patentable compounds that can recoup that investment through market exclusivity. A plant that anyone can grow, process, and sell cannot be patented. The economics of the FDA approval pathway make it structurally inaccessible for naturally occurring botanical compounds that the pharmaceutical industry doesn't own. The science gap, then, was not merely a gap in knowledge. It was a gap engineered by the intersection of regulatory design, funding structures, and economic incentives, a gap that kept the plant in permanent legal limbo while allowing derivative research to proceed in parallel, protected by intellectual property law and institutional legitimacy that the plant itself could never access. The knowledge that would resolve the kratom question definitively, large-scale human trials, longitudinal outcome studies, comprehensive pharmacokinetic profiling across real-world populations, remained unbuilt, and the longer it remained unbuilt, the longer millions of people would continue making decisions based on forum posts, vendor testimonials, and the partial, distorted signal that the existing literature managed to produce. The tree kept growing in Indonesian jungles, indifferent to the arguments being made about it in laboratories and congressional hearing rooms. Its alkaloids kept binding to receptors in American brains, producing effects that defied clean categorization. And the legal landscape around it kept shifting state by state in directions that suggested not resolution, but the permanent fractured coexistence of incompatible certainties. The United States, as of the mid-2000s, has no coherent federal policy on kratom. What it has instead is a legal quilt stitched together from 50 different state decisions, dozens of municipal ordinances, unresolved FDA positioning, a DEA still technically capable of emergency scheduling, and a pharmaceutical research pipeline quietly advancing in the background, all operating simultaneously, all pointing in different directions, none of them coordinated with any of the others. Alabama banned kratom in 2016, placing mitragynine and 7-hydroxymitragynine on the state's controlled substances list. Arkansas, Indiana, Rhode Island, Vermont, and Wisconsin followed. In those 6 states, possessing kratom carries criminal penalties. A veteran in Wisconsin managing chronic pain with the same substance that a veteran in neighboring Minnesota can buy legally online faces, arrest, and prosecution. The border between those 2 states runs through the same opioid crisis, the same population of people with the same unmet medical needs, and it means nothing pharmacologically. It means everything legally. The municipal layer adds further complexity. San Diego banned Kratom in 2016 before the California state legislature declined to schedule it, creating a situation where the same substance was illegal in one city and legal 30 miles away in the same state. Sarasota County in Florida imposed a local ban while the rest of Florida remained permissive. Denver, in one of the more bizarre regulatory moments in this entire story, briefly moved toward restriction before pulling back. The patchwork isn't just national, it's granular, inconsistent, and impossible for an ordinary person to navigate without a legal research team. The Kratom Consumer Protection Act became the advocacy community's primary legislative vehicle for imposing order on this chaos, not by legalizing Kratom everywhere, but by establishing a regulatory framework wherever it passed. The model legislation required vendors to register with state agencies, mandated independent laboratory testing for alkaloid content and contaminants, set minimum age requirements at 18 or 21 depending on state version, required accurate labeling, and prohibited adulterated or spiked products. It was, in essence, an argument that regulated Kratom was safer than banned Kratom, and that the appropriate response to an unregulated market's dangers was regulation rather than prohibition. Utah's passage of the KCPA in 2019 was the first proof of concept. The change in the state's Kratom market was measurable. Vendors who couldn't meet testing requirements exited, product quality documentation improved, contaminated products became easier to identify and remove. Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, and Oklahoma passed versions of the legislation in subsequent years. Each passage generated a template for the next state and demonstrated that regulatory frameworks for Kratom were politically achievable even in environments where drug policy reform was not broadly popular. The opposition to KCPA passage came from two directions that made unusual political bedfellows. Law enforcement and drug control advocates argued that any regulatory framework legitimized a dangerous substance and created a legal infrastructure that would make eventual federal scheduling harder. From the opposite direction, some public health researchers argued that the KCPA's provisions were insufficient, that age requirements and testing mandates, while positive, didn't address the fundamental question of therapeutic claims, dosing standardization, or the concentrated extract products that presented the highest risk profile. Both critiques contained legitimate points. Neither produced an alternative legislative proposal with comparable political momentum. While American states were arguing among themselves, the country where Kratom had grown wild for centuries made a decision that reframed the entire international context. Thailand legalized Kratom in August 2021, not decriminalized, not deprioritized, but fully legalized, removing it from the national narcotics list after nearly 80 years of prohibition. The reversal was driven by a combination of factors: recognition that the original 1943 ban had been economically rather than medically motivated, growing acknowledgement that Kratom use among rural Thai populations had never generated the public health crisis that prohibition had promised to prevent, and a practical assessment that legalization with regulation was producing better outcomes than enforcement in the jurisdictions that had tried it. The Thai government established a regulatory framework that required licensing for commercial cultivation, processing, and sale. It set quality standards, it restricted certain high-concentration products, and it immediately created a legal export industry that had profound implications for the global supply chain, including the American market. Thai Kratom, grown under government oversight with documented agricultural standards, began competing with the Indonesian supply that had dominated the American market through years of minimal regulatory oversight. The quality differential was, in early assessments, significant. The Thai legalization also created a geopolitical argument that Kratom advocates deployed with considerable effectiveness in American legislative hearings. If the country of Kratom's origin, the country that had banned it specifically because it was cutting into drug tax revenue, the country with the longest and most direct experience of its social effects across generations of users, had concluded that full legalization with regulation was the appropriate policy response. That conclusion carried evidentiary weight that pure pharmacology arguments couldn't replicate. Malaysia remained more cautious, maintaining restrictions while allowing traditional use to continue with minimal enforcement in rural areas. Indonesia, the world's largest kratom exporter by volume, had repeatedly discussed scheduling kratom domestically, a move that would devastate the global supply chain essentially overnight, given that the majority of kratom consumed in the United States was grown in Borneo and Sumatra. Indonesian kratom farmers had become economically dependent on the American market in ways that created a strange geopolitical alignment. The livelihoods of rural Indonesian agricultural communities were directly tied to American regulatory decisions made by people who had never visited a kratom farm and never would. Every time the DEA signaled renewed interest in federal scheduling, Indonesian agricultural associations sent formal diplomatic communications to American trade representatives. The plant had acquired an international political dimension that nobody planning the original 2016 scheduling attempt had anticipated. The FDA's position through the early 2000s remained formally unchanged but practically static. The agency continued classifying kratom as an adulterated dietary supplement, continued issuing import alerts and warning letters to vendors making therapeutic claims, and continued maintaining that the path to legitimate status ran through the IND and clinical trial process. What changed was the tone. The aggressive public communication campaign of the Gottlieb era, the alarming press releases, the algorithmic opioid classifications, quieted considerably. The agency that had declared kratom indistinguishable from heroin was now issuing far fewer declarations of any kind. Whether this represented a strategic retreat, an institutional acknowledgement that the previous approach had been counterproductive, or simply a change in political priorities was impossible to determine from the outside. The effect was the same regardless of the cause. Federal enforcement became less visible, state-level frameworks continued developing in both directions, and the kratom market continued operating in its fragmented, partially regulated, partially chaotic form. The pharmaceutical pipeline continued advancing independently of all political developments. By the mid-2000s, mitragynine pseudoindoxil, the Columbia University derivative, had progressed through sufficient preclinical testing to generate serious discussion of IND filing. Other institutions were pursuing different mitragynine analogues through parallel tracks. The commercial logic was undeniable. A pharmaceutical company that successfully brought a kratom-derived compound through FDA approval would hold patent exclusivity over a pain management or addiction treatment drug in markets worth tens of billions of dollars annually. The investment required was enormous. The potential return was larger. The timeline for that development, if it succeeded, was a decade or more. In the meantime, the 3 to 5 million Americans using kratom daily, the veterans, the chronic pain patients, the people in recovery, the simply curious, would continue existing in the legal and informational environment that currently surrounded them. Partially legal, partially banned, essentially unregulated at the federal level, served by a market that ranged from responsible vendors who tested their products meticulously to gas station operators who had never thought seriously about what they were putting on their shelves. The unanswered question at the center of the kratom story is not ultimately a pharmacological question. The pharmacology is complicated but resolvable. Given adequate funding, proper research infrastructure, and the political will to pursue answers rather than predetermined conclusions, science could characterize kratom's risks and benefits with the same rigor applied to any pharmaceutical compound. That work is possible, it simply hasn't been done. The unanswered question is a systems question. It is the question of what a society does when the official channels for evaluating and distributing medical tools fail, when pharmaceutical economics makes certain compounds unviable for the approval process, when insurance systems and specialist availability leave millions of people without access to legitimate care, when the drug supply becomes so contaminated with fentanyl that virtually anything offering an alternative looks acceptable by comparison. Kratom didn't create any of those failures. It grew in their shadow. Every regulatory decision made about Kratom is actually two decisions simultaneously. A decision about the plant and a decision about the people who need it. The DEA's 2016 scheduling attempt was a decision that millions of opioid recovery patients should find another option, without specifying what that option was. Every state prohibition is the same decision repeated. Find something else, without offering what that something else might be. The something else for a meaningful fraction of that population is fentanyl. The math on that trade-off has never been formally calculated by any agency that has moved to restrict Kratom. Thailand calculated it. The Thai government looked at 80 years of prohibition, looked at the population of rural users who had never stopped using Kratom regardless of its legal status, and concluded that the prohibition had generated more harm than the substance. That calculation took 80 years, and required watching an entire generation of users treated as criminals for consuming a plant their grandparents had used freely. The United States characteristically is taking a different approach, not deciding. The federal government has chosen the liminal state, not approved, not banned, not studied at adequate scale, not regulated at the national level as its effective policy. It is a choice that serves nobody cleanly. It leaves users unprotected by quality standards. It leaves clinicians without guidance. It leaves researchers underfunded. It leaves the public without honest information. And it leaves the plant exactly where it has always been, growing in the jungle, indifferent to the arguments made about it in rooms full of people who have never touched a kratom leaf. The tree that started this story as a Southeast Asian farmer's unremarkable workday companion has become, in the American context, a mirror. What it reflects back is not a drug crisis. It is a decision-making crisis. The specific compounding failure of institutions that were designed to protect public health, and have, in the case of Kratom, spent a decade protecting everything except that. The leaf is still growing. The debate is still unresolved. The people in the gaps are still there, still waiting, still measuring out their daily dose and doing the same arithmetic they've always done, weighing what they know against what they've been told, and choosing the option that lets them get through the day. Nobody in any position of authority has given them a better one yet.